Alright, hey guys, today is Thursday, May 14th for Algebra 1. So today we're going to deal with zeros of functions. And so a definition here is a zero of a function is a value of the independent variable that causes the function to equal to 0. And so basically all we're going to be doing is we're going to be setting the numerator equal to 0, and then those are going to give you the zeros for the function. And so that, again, is just the definition there for you. So we're just going to work through a couple of these first. Find number 1 through 8, just say find the intercepts of each equation. And so to find an intercept is basically where you have to find the zeros for the equation, only you're going to deal with x and y. And so what's going to happen here is that we're just going to set the x equal to 0 and solve for the y, or set the y equal to 0 and solve for x. And so to find the x-intercept, where it crosses the x-axis, we're going to set the y equal to 0 and see where it finds the x, and then vice versa for the y. And so I'm going to do the x first. And so I'm just going to plug a 0 in. Well, either one you can do first, really. I'll just plug a 0 into the x. So, since I plugged the 0 into the x, the coordinate for this is going to be 0, and then I'm looking for this. And so remember, it's x, y, and so if I plug in a 0 into the x, then in my coordinate I write a 0 in the x place. Okay? So then I just do the algebra, and then I'm going to figure out what that would be. So I plugged in a 0, and so basically when I plug in a 0, it just goes away. So 5 times 0 is 0, so it goes away. And then that leaves me just 3y equals 15. And then I'm going to solve for y. And so I have to divide both sides by 3. And so I end up with y equals 5. And so that y is 5 where x is 0. So then I'm just going to plug my coordinate. My y is 5. And so one answer then would be 0, 5. Okay? So that is doing it with the 0 into the x. So you just plug in the 0. Got 3y equals 15. Solve it, divide by 3, and get y equals 5. Then that's your point. Now, to do the x, I'm going to plug in a 0 in for y. So I'm going to plug in my 0 into the y. So then my coordinate is going to be a 0 into the y, and I'm looking for that x. So then when I plug a 0 into the y, it goes away. And so I'm left with just 5x equals 15. So then I'm going to divide by 5 to solve for x, and I'll wind up with x equals 3. And so that would be my x-coordinate. So my y-intercept and my x-intercepts are 0, 5, and 3, 0. Those are going to be my intercepts. I'll do number 8 as well. So 8, I'm going to plug in a 0 into the x. So that'll tell me my coordinate is going to be a 0 into the x, and I'm looking for my y. So then it goes away and just leaves me with 9y squared equals 9. So then solving for y squared, I divide by 9, I end up with y squared equals 1. So then that's what y squared is, I don't know what y is. So then I divide, square root both sides, and that tells me y equals plus or minus 1. When you take a square root over 1, you get plus or minus 1. So, what that tells me is that one coordinate has a negative 1, and then I have another coordinate that has a positive 1. So I actually had 2. When I plugged in a 0 in for x, I actually got 2 answers back. I got a 1 and a negative 1, so you have 2 points. You have a negative 1, 0, negative 1, and then 0, 1. So that was for when the x is 0. So now I'm going to do one where the y is 0. So again, I'm plugging a 0 into the y. And so that means my coordinate will have a 0 in the y, and I'm looking for the x. So that means that goes away, and it leaves me with x squared equals 9. So then I square root both sides and get x equals plus or minus 3. So then that means I have one answer where it's negative 3, comma 0. Then I have another answer where it's positive 3, comma 0. Because when I plugged in a 0 in for y, I got 2 answers, plus and minus 3. And so that then is going to be how you do 1 through 8. You just plug a 0 into x, a 0 in for y, and solve. 9 through 28 is you're actually doing the finding the zeros. So you're setting the numerator equal to 0 and solving. And so you're setting the numerator equal to 0 and solving. And so number 9 I'll do. So number 9, you have x plus 1. So I'm going to set the numerator equal to 0. So I'm going to set x plus 1 equal to 0 and solve. So subtract 1, and I get x equals negative 1. So that would be my 0 for number 9. Now this isn't, that's not saying 0 equals negative 1, it's just the definition of what we call them. Basically it's an intercept. And so we're just saying that our 0 for this problem is x equals negative 1. Alright, number 15, again, you're setting the numerator equal to 0. It doesn't matter what the denominator is. So they could do x plus 7 on the bottom. It doesn't even matter, it's going to work the exact same way. And so you're only looking at the numerator for these. And so again, you're going to set x squared plus x minus 2 equal to 0. When I do this, I'm going to have to actually factor that. So I'm going to do guess and check. So I'm going to do the factors of negative 2 that add up to a positive x. So again, factors of 2 are just 2 and 1. Factors of x are x and x. Okay, Martine, what does this negative sign mean? Should mean different signs. So one's going to be a minus, one's going to be a plus. X, x. Now I'm looking for a positive x. And so I'm going to put, I'll put the 1 here and the 2 there. And so to check that, you would do x times 2, which would be 2x. Minus 1 will give you the middle as an x. So those are the two factors. So then you just have to solve each of those. And so it would be x minus 1 equal to 0, which would be x equals 1. And then it would be x plus 2 equal to 0, which would give you x equals negative 2. Subtracting 2 from both sides. And so those would be your two zeros. Alright, number 19 I will do as well. Again, you're just looking for where the numerator is equal to 0, and so that's where you're setting equal to 0. So you have a radical here on 19. So again, we're just going to set what's inside the radical equal to 0. And so I'm going to do 2x minus 4 equals 0. So add 4 to both sides. And I get 2x equals 4, divide by 2, and I get x equals 2. And so that would be your 0, x equals 2. And so that's all you're doing, setting the denominator equal to 0 on those. So, that's all you have to do. You just have to remember a factor if you need a factor. Setting the numerator equal to 0. I might say the denominator, but it's the numerator equal to 0 for these. Alright, one thing we'll do next, we'll do a couple. This is useful because we're going to look at 29 through 34. These are useful because it says find the zeros of each function, identify the vertex, and graph the parabola. So basically what happens is a parabola is going to be a U-shaped graph. So a parabola is basically going to be something like this. It's going to be a U, that's a parabola. And the function for a parabola is going to be an x squared, it's going to be a quadratic. And so if you look at like 29, it says f of x equals, and then it says x squared minus 1. So how you do these, basically what we need to know is we need to know the zeros. Because what the zeros are going to tell us is it's going to tell us where this graph crosses the x-axis. And so for example, this one I just made up over here to the right, or the left, basically the 0 is going to be these two places where that line crosses the x-axis, where our parabola crosses the x-axis. So if we find our zeros, we know where our graph crosses the x-axis. And so that's what we're going to do first, is identify the zeros for each of these. And so again, you're just going to solve them, setting the numerator equal to 0. So here, I have x squared minus 1. We can do guess and check with that, or we can just do the x squared equals a number, square root both sides. I'm going to do it that way. So I'm going to set x squared minus 1 equal to 0. Again, if you did guess and check, this would be factors of 1 that when they add up give you a 0x. And so I'm just going to do I'm just going to do the square root method though. So it'd be, I'm going to add 1 to both sides. And so x squared equals 1. So then when I square root both sides, I'm going to end up with x equals plus or minus 1. So what that tells me is my zeros for my answer is I'm going to have 1, here's my graph. I'm going to have 1, 0 at x equals 1. So I'm going to have 1 over here. Then I'm going to have 1 at x equals negative 1. So I'm going to have 1 right here. And this is the reason they're called zeros, because they cross the x-axis where the x is 0 at these spots. So the x-axis is basically a horizontal line, that's the line x equals 0. And so the reason these are called zeros is because this is where our graph crosses that x-axis. And so it crosses at 1 and negative 1. Okay? So that's that first part. Now notice the second part says identify the vertex. The vertex of a parabola is the very bottom and very top. So the vertex is basically this bottom point. So this bottom point is the vertex. So these are the zeros, that's the 0, and then the vertex is the very bottom point. And so notice it's going to be symmetric. The middle point down there at the bottom, or if it's flipped, you can also have a parabola that's flipped, where it's a U shape coming down. But basically that bottom or very top point is going to be symmetric. It's going to be exactly in the middle between the two zeros on the sides. And so basically I just have to find out where these cross. So to find where they cross, what you do is you find the average. And so what you're going to do is whatever your 0 is to find the vertex, you just take those two, subtract them, and divide by 2. And so what we're going to do then is do 1, so we have negative 1 and 1, so it's going to be negative 1 plus 1, so you just add by 2 zeros, it's 1 and negative 1, so you're going to add those together, negative 1 plus 1, and then divide by 2, basically find the average. And so negative 1 plus 1 is 0, 0 divided by 2 is of course 0, and so the vertex is going to be 0. So what that tells me is that my vertex, my x-coordinate for my vertex is 0. So when I'm getting my x-coordinate for my vertex, the x-coordinate is going to be 0. Now to find the y-coordinate, all you do is you plug whatever this x is back into the original and solve for y. So find the x-coordinate, plug back in for my vertex, and I plug back in up here. So it'd be 0 squared minus 1, which would be negative 1. So that tells me that the y-coordinate would be negative 1. So then I'm just going to graph that point. So the x is 0, and then it's down negative 1. So it'd be right there. And so my parabola then would look like that. So again, to find the zeros, you just set it equal to the top equal to 0, the numerator equal to 0. To find the vertex, you take those zeros, whatever your answer is, add them together, divide by 2. So whatever these two answers are, add them together, divide by 2. And then that will give you the x-coordinate for your vertex. To find the y-coordinate for your vertex, you just plug back in your x-coordinate to the very original. And then that will give you your y-coordinate, then you graph it. Remember, x goes left to right, y goes up, down. And so that's pretty much the lesson. I'll save those other ones for you to do yourself, so there's only a few of them. But that's how you're going to do them. And so if you have any questions, you can get with me, but that's today's lesson. So I hope you'll have a good day. Any questions, again, just get with me and we'll go through it.